Welcome everyone to our second concurrent panel. I'm Lauren Ordway-Evans, staff to the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. We have a great discussion lined up for you this afternoon. Before we kick things off, we will hear from Palm Beach County Vice Mayor Greg Weiss with a short video on climate resilience in Palm Beach.
It's impacting us in a number of ways. District 2 does border along the Lake Worth Lagoon, and so we're seeing impacts from sunny day flooding. And so as you know, we see an increase in water levels in the lagoon. Our stormwater system's not able to keep up with that. Additionally, if you look a little to the west, we have some low-lying areas within the district as well that get flooded and see a significant impact due to that flooding. And so we're going to need to make some changes both to the levels that we're building at, but as also as how we're going to move that stormwater away from our roads and homes and properties in the district. Some of the most difficult challenges that we have right now, number one is education, helping people understand the impacts, how quickly they're happening, how much we're going to have to adjust to them and make changes, and the costs involved. So these are long-term impacts that they're not going away, and we're going to continue to need to invest our resources, but we're going to need to partner with the state and federal government because this is beyond what a local government alone can manage. My message to them is to continue to push on the levers of political power, if you will, of the importance of addressing this. We see the impacts every day, and yet we continue to make some of the same mistakes that we've made in the past. So addressing the low-hanging fruit, if you will, early on, and as things become more challenging, we'll be prepared to be able to take on those bigger tasks. But I'm delighted to have so many young people involved because this is the existential threat to all of us going forward. I mean, we go from the beaches all the way to the Everglades, from the farmlands to the urban areas. There is something here for everybody, whether you're a water person, an equestrian. There's just a lot of things to do and see, but so much of it is based on the natural environment that we are so blessed to have here in Palm Beach County.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Weiss. Now let's dive into our session, 0 Hour, the economic imperative of decarbonization and a just transition. To moderate this conversation, I'm pleased to introduce Kate Stein, adjunct lecturer in the Department of Journalism at Florida International University and facilitator for the Upper Limit Project. Ms. Stein was formerly an environmental reporter for WLRN, South Florida's member station, and has worked on sustainability, resilience, and public engagement for both the cities of Miami and Surfside. Thank you for joining us, Kate. I will turn it over to you.
Great, Lauren. Thanks a lot for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited for this session. I'm going to hand it over right away to Dr. Catherine Mock for a brief introduction to the magnitude of the challenge that Florida is facing and the imperative of decarbonization and doing that in a just way. Dr. Mock is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of Miami. She is the 2020 recipient of the Piers Sellers Prize for world-leading contributions to solutions-focused climate research. She's also a lead author for the IPCC 6th Assessment report, and she's a chapter lead for the US with National Climate Assessment. So Dr. Mock, we're really happy to have you, and please go ahead, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's really an honor to provide a little bit of the science behind the economic imperative of decarbonization and a just transition. So what do we know from the science? I think the place to start is where we are right now. The world has warmed about 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. That's a really abstract number, 1.1 degrees Celsius. But in the whole history of people and the planet, it's a lot. We are already seeing widespread and dangerous disruption impacts for people and nature on every single continent of the globe, certainly here in Southeast Florida. Some of the impacts are associated with the extremes, the sharp ends of our climate system, whether the very hottest of days that are also humid, or storms now arriving onshore on top of rising seas and in an atmosphere that can hold more water and have heavier rainfall. But some of the impacts that are being experienced are really about the cumulative burden of the changing climate and who is bearing it. What happens when every single day is a little bit hotter? What happens when every single tide is a little bit higher and waters come into our storm drains, as we've been hearing this morning, and oftentimes are making our septic systems less effective and more leaky. Other key point that we know from the science is that intensifying warming, increasing warming will intensify the risks. The risks of a changing climate are risks for our economies, risks for our health, risks for our food, water, nature, and every single one of our communities. Many of the impacts in a changing climate will be severe, and many will be irreversible on the timeframes of our lives and even millennia into the future. But the good news is that the solutions are in our hands already. We have most of the technologies we need to address the climate crisis. Communities, the private sector, and governments are innovating rapidly, as you'll hear on this panel. So what do we know about the necessary decarbonization and just transition ahead? What the science shows very unambiguously is that greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide lead to long-term warming. So as a result of the physics of our climate, limiting the warming that occurs requires reaching net zero emissions of carbon dioxide, zero emissions of carbon dioxide, as well as achieving at the same time strong reductions in other heat-trapping gases. That means that substantial, rapid, and sustained reductions in our emissions of heat-trapping gases are necessary, and they'll quickly lead to beneficial outcomes, reducing the amount of climate change that occurs, reducing the impacts that occur, and also improving air quality here in the United States and also globally. The last point that I'll close with is that there is urgency. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or to 2 degrees Celsius requires substantial reductions in our emissions of heat-trapping gases this decade, reaching net zero emissions of CO2 by the middle of the century. As we'll explore in the panel, the technologies and strategies that already exist, that work well, that are economically viable, can go a very long way in meeting this challenge of decarbonization and a just transition. This is solar and wind, electric vehicles, reducing deforestation globally, deploying climate smart agriculture. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of technological innovation for those hardest to decarbonize sectors, whether it's cement or steel or long distance travel or shipping. And putting all of these pieces together, what we really see from the science is that there's an immense opportunity to lead and to learn, seizing the moment and deploying these technologies that already exist, these technologies that will really define our 21st century. And doing so is central to the health, the well-being, and the jobs that people have today, and also for the many generations to come. So thank you, Kate, and back to you.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So many important points that you touched on there. I mean, the fact that the strategies and technology for decarbonization already exist for the large part, and that this is an opportunity as we respond to these different impacts, it's really an economic imperative, just as much as it is a risk reduction measure to decarbonize. So I'm really excited for our panel today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers now. First of all, and if the speakers could come on camera as I make the introduction. First of all, Matt Valley is the Vice President of Development at Florida Power and Light. FPL is, of course, the largest energy company in the United States by some measures. It serves over 8 million Floridians. Matt leads new project and program development for a range of different technologies, including solar, batteries, electric vehicles, and natural gas. His team's work includes executing FPL's 30 by 30 plan to install 30 million solar panels by 2030. He also works on launching FPL's Solar Together community solar program and building out an electric vehicle charging program to link the major travel corridors in Florida. Matt, welcome. Next, we have Ryan Evans, who is the Executive Director of Chambers for Innovation and Clean Energy. Chambers helps local chambers of commerce and their member companies navigate and prosper in the clean energy space, and we're lucky to have the benefit of that expertise right here in Florida. Ryan oversees operations, strategy, and policy development, and he's a recognized leader on renewable energy policy, the economic effects of air quality, and community engagement. Ryan, welcome. Happy to have you. Finally, we have Toya Callahan, who is the Deputy Director for the Soul Smart program at the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. Soul Smart, as many of you are aware, provides communities with technical assistance to become solar ready and then recognizes communities' achievements with gold, silver, and bronze Soul Smart designations. This program has done a lot to help local governments save money and grow the local economy, and many of the attendees at the summit their communities are participants. So Toya, very happy to have you. So we heard from Dr. Mock about the limited window that we have to accelerate decarbonization and how acting now will help us stabilize the climate. And what I want to focus on in today's panel is how do we get to net zero emissions in a way that's effective as far as reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, of course, but also how do we do it in a way that's equitable? So what we're going to talk about is getting to net zero, i.e. getting to building an economy that emits no more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere than are stored and removed each year. So we're balancing out our emissions with decarbonization measures. And I wanted to start out by asking each of the panelists just to talk in general. I mean, we obviously know the sustainability and environmental benefits, the risks that we protect ourselves from by decarbonization and lessening the amount of global warming that takes place and all those attendant effects. But I wanted to focus to start on the economic benefits, because obviously that's a key thing that we're thinking about in the state of Florida. So Ryan, I'm going to start with you, and I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about the work that you and your team have done as far as economic benefits of decarbonization to Florida and Southeast Florida in particular? Why do we want to do this from an economic perspective?
Thanks, Kate. Sure. So our organization, Chambers for Innovation and Clean Energy, has been around for about 10 years now, and we've never really made it our mission to promote the environmental benefits of clean energy. Our mission has always been to talk about the financial opportunity, economic benefits of clean energy. Just where we felt that not only would we have the most impact in terms of educating the broad public across the country, but also just with our constituency group, which is chambers of commerce and economic development organizations across the country, including a lot that we work with in Florida directly. And when it comes to the economic opportunities, first, I will say that to decarbonize is an incredible way to boost an economy. We've seen this over and over as economies invest in clean energy and they continue to really look at what they can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the one thing is it takes an all hands on deck approach. So it should not be fully on a utility or a municipality, for example, to invest in clean energy, energy efficiency, et cetera. But communities really need to empower citizens and their corporate citizens to be involved. The latter, corporate citizens, are probably the most critical. We shouldn't be limiting options, but rather exploring all options where the private sector can invest its own capital to help the effort. Specifically, why this is important for an economy and what it can do for Florida specifically. First, solar and wind are the least expensive form of new energy generation now, and they accounted for an overwhelming majority of new energy generation brought online in the last several years. It's true that only a small percentage of our current overall generation comes from solar or wind, but that only means that we have tremendous opportunity for growth, given that our country's energy demand grows every year, as is the case in Florida in both respects. Solar and wind also help hedge fuel cost increases and provide decades of predictable utility pricing, electrical pricing. There are more people employed by renewables across the country than in fossil fuels because of the more distributed nature of the generation and growing demand for renewables specifically. Cheaper energy is also good for corporate procurement to garner their investment in the process. And we should be encouraging them to invest their capital rather than discouraging it. And lastly, at least as a starting kind of opening statement, I will say that renewables also bring, because of their distributed nature, a huge economic benefit for rural communities and more rural parts of Florida specifically. They can provide millions in capital investment to places that typically struggle to attract investment and bring with them many and short and long-term goals and decades of property taxes. And in fact, in rural communities, quite often, a solar or wind development is typically the highest taxpayer in a rural community. So I'll stop there for now, but I think that hopefully sets the stage a little bit for what is possible with economic investment in renewable energy, cleaner energy, and decarbonizing.
Great, thanks, Ryan. You make a really important point there about the many ways in which decarbonization and renewable energy can provide an economic boost to an area. And that's something, we'll get to this more later, but Chambers, as you obviously know, worked on a great report about Miami's carbon competitiveness compared with other cities in the United States and the opportunities to attract investment related to that. So we'll come back to that in just a minute, but I want to go to Toya next. Toya, can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, especially working with local governments, what are some of the economic benefits of decarbonization in Florida? What do you see?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just point on, I'll make two major points. The way I look at it, specifically with my work, we, really help to work with local governments to reduce those solar soft costs. So that process itself helps these local governments cut the red tape that's associated with some of the administrative and solar procedures. And in return, with the work that we do, it actually attracts industry into those communities, so which then actually contributes to the fostering of those solar markets. I can also talk about some of the studies that we've found with the communities that we worked with. We actually saw an increase in solar capacity overall, which is a 67 increase with a comparison between communities that have not gone through the program versus those who haven't. And then overall, an increase in additional solar capacity. So 12,800 to 19,200 new solar installations with the communities that have actually gone through the program. I also want to talk about workforce development. One of the things that we do annually is we conduct a solar census report. And it was really interesting to see some of the findings in our last year's solar job census. So Florida actually ranked as one of the top states for total solar employment growth since 2015. And that was actually a 71% increase. And that total solar workforce really comes up to 11,219. And really just to give you a perspective of that is there's a lot of work to be done in this space. There are a lot of jobs to be created. There's a lot of opportunity in the state of Florida, but also really making sure that environmental justice and equity are embedded in those practices, and growth for planning is critical, especially as we're trying to meet the challenges of climate change and the energy transition and social environmental justice problems that we face.
Great, thank you. So obviously huge job creation opportunities associated with transitioning to renewable energy, in particular solar. Matt, I want to go to you now and ask, at the start of this panel, I listed off a bunch of the different exciting renewable energy projects that you've been working on with FPL. I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about economic benefits that you've seen to the company and then also to the state as you've put more resources towards renewables?
Yeah, and good to be with you. I think a lot of good points have been made on solar and the economics. I think one of the key points, Kate and Ryan, you had highlighted this earlier, is just the overwhelming economic benefit of doing solar now. So obviously part of our job as a utility is to plan for all that future growth. There's a lot of it coming to the state right now, and then thinking about turning over the existing fleet. If you go back 20 years, 25 years now in our system, FPL burned, and this is kind of an amazing thing, when I think about it, this is for the time that I was here, but we burned more oil to generate electricity than any utility in America, right? And we also had a lot of historical coal plants. Over the last 20 years, we have been shutting down for economic reasons the oil, the coal, and we had replaced up until like 2016 with natural gas, right? Which is better than coal and oil. It's still not 100% renewable, but that enabled us to have a very efficient gas fleet, obviously around the clock and supporting all the growth that's come to Florida in the last 20 years. One statistic, when you think about that compound growth and kind of what we're facing, is that we sell 50% more energy today than we did 20 years ago. So just think about that, and we're trying to go zero carbon, over time, and that's in the face of that. Plus the transportation sector now is going to add to that historical growth, right? So we're a massive state. It is a huge amount of energy that needs to be converted over. But since 2016, the tides have really changed, and solar has become the most economic thing, as Ryan said, when we do the utility resource planning. And that's a combination of a number of things, but solar, with the existing tax credits that are out there, is the most economic choice when we look at what is the next generation unit to bring on the system. So we had said, you had mentioned the 30 by 30 goal. That was our attempt to take things out of gigawatts and put them into panels so that people, the average person in Florida can understand 30 million panels by 2030. We announced that goal in 2018, and we've put 12 million of them in to date. And that is about 1 times around planet Earth when you stack them side by side. So that is a significant amount of energy that is now being generated by solar. Obviously, we have a lot more to go, but we're looking out into the future thinking, not only is it volume, and we can come back to that point on equity and rural investment, but I would agree, these are $90 million projects that are going in rural parts of the state of Florida and becoming large tax base for those communities with no demand on the county services. So we think a lot about the solar, the magnitude of what's going on, and then also the battery storage that is going to be needed to kind of balance that out. Everybody gets solar doesn't, do anything for us at night. So we've got to increasingly turn the system over and put more battery storage in places where we can store that solar energy and then use it later in the evening. And I think as a final point, if you look far enough in the future, you start to bring in green hydrogen as the additional element to getting our grid and probably other parts of the Florida economy to zero carbon someday.
Great. So definitely, it's very striking, I think, the different combination of renewables that FPL is exploring and the way that you're looking to scale them up. I wanted to ask a follow-up, actually, because obviously FPL should be commended. You've committed to cutting carbon dioxide emissions, I think 67% by 2025, which is really quite substantial. But we've been talking about the economic importance of cutting emissions to zero and the fact that local governments cannot achieve decarbonization on their own. They need the support of their utilities. So can we expect to see a net zero commitment from FPL at any point? And if so, do you have a sense of when that might be?
Yeah, I think a couple points. So right now the goal at FPL was the 30 by 30, which again it's a translation of a reduction into something that we felt like would have the most impact. We're going to hit that 30 by 30 goal in 2025. We're going to be 5 years early. So I think it's fair to say you're going to hear something new from FPL next year at some point. But right now that's the goal that we're on. The other thing I would say, and this is not just FPL, but NextEra, and right, the other part of our company is the largest renewable energy developer of solar, wind, and battery storage in the country by far, is that our company's belief is, first off, it's zero carbon, not net zero, right? And then the second thing is near-term goals. The issue that we have sometimes we talk about internally about 2050 goals is no one's around, right, to kind of own that. So we think a lot about what is the thing that you're going to do in the next 3 to 5 years. And so I think when I'm talking about our next goal, if we hit the 2030 goal early, I think you're going to see us potentially announce a new 2030 goal where we have line of sight and we're planning to it, and the people that are here really working to that goal. One other point I'd make on, you had highlighted the community solar program, Solar Together, you know, in the bio and in the intro. That was our first attempt, and we've added to that program to enable, because we get, even if FPL gets there all the way in 2040, 2050, and it's a substantial amount of effort for anybody to get there, that we have customers that want to get there faster. So was there an equitable way to do it for the rest of our customer base, right? And we're responsible for everybody, but to allow certain customers who want to participate voluntarily to jump ahead, and that was that Solar Together program, which I'm happy to say we sold it out last year, but we've just added about the same amount of capacity that we'll be launching in the later part of 22.
Great. I want to pick up on that theme of equity. Obviously, one of the challenges in addressing the energy transition is to make sure that it's equitable. As we all know, people who are making the minimum wage, for example, might not be able to afford an electric vehicle, or homeowners might not be able to afford the upfront costs of installing solar panels, although obviously there are many different initiatives underway to make solar more affordable for homeowners. Toya, I want to go to you. SolSmart has done a lot of research on sort of equity challenges to energy transition, and has also committed to ensuring an equitable energy transition, making that a priority in the past year or so. How do we ensure that those most impacted by climate change will benefit rather than be left behind by the clean energy transition?
Yeah, I think that at least as a program, we've made that conscious effort to really make sure this is part of a conversation. So really focusing on providing outreach and technical assistance to actually those underserved communities, entire underserved communities, and the ones that have either resource or staffing challenges, but also looking at resources and tools to help underserved populations within larger cities. So for instance, LMI neighborhoods in larger cities. And from what I'm finding, there are a large number of resources that are being developed, not just by SolSmart, but other organizations that we partner with. I'll point out one specifically, an LMI solarized campaign guidebook for ways to have solarized campaigns for directly tailored to LMI communities. I've seen public-private partnerships where private companies are partnering with utilities to really provide those solar solutions to LMI communities, whether it's through a community solar subscription model. So I am starting to see definitely a lot of stakeholders that are looking at this as a critical issue to target and finding really innovative ways to navigate it.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point and sort of go to you now, Ryan, and here, so we heard about some of the innovative things that are happening on sort of the residential side or the individual family side of things when it comes to equity and ensuring that transition is equitable. What are you hearing from the chambers that you work with or the businesses that they work with as far as policies that can help ensure the energy transition, reaches small businesses, for example, as well as larger corporations? Are there specific policies or initiatives or things that you're coming across that we should be keeping in mind?
Sure, thank you. So as Matt said, I think that, obviously community solar type programs are important because it does give access to just about anybody, well, depending upon the utility, depending upon the community, it gives us access to just about anybody who may or may not have the opportunity to go solar on their own. For example, someone who lives in an apartment complex or who lives in a heavily wooded area. So those are important. But I think the most important part is expanding opportunities, not limiting those opportunities. So one thing that we typically hear from legislators, conservative legislators in Florida, chambers, and businesses is power purchase agreements and expanding those opportunities for corporations to privately contract with renewable energy developers, for example, for a certain amount of solar energy, and fairly compensate a utility at the same time for operating the transmission lines that carry that privately sourced energy. So that's one that we hear a lot about. We also hear a lot about reasonable and fair utility tariffs, trying to develop those out so there's more options for corporate renewals, whether they can privately contract with a developer or not, but at least they can contract with the utility for their own purchase of however many megawatts of solar, for example, a small business or a large business wants to contract with. And the last is net metering is probably the most relevant, and as far as these conversations go, but net metering is rooftop solar, and really allowing corporations to, and individuals for that matter, individual homeowners, to have access without being penalized, the opportunity to produce solar on top of their roofs. And the beauty of all of these examples is that it really brings in that private sector investment to the equation. Otherwise, it really is all in the backs of a utility or a municipality or a state government to move all of this clean energy procurement and development forward. But when you give more options to residents and corporations, you only increase your opportunity for not only furthering the effort and making it faster, but also letting the vast majority shoulder it rather than just a few entities shoulder that capital investment.
Yeah, I think the point that you're making about partnerships and having it not be on local governments and not on the utility is super important, and that's something I want to come back to. Matt, I want to go to you though first and just ask. You touched a little bit on the things that FPL is considering when it comes to equity, but I wanted to ask you specifically, what kind of role do you anticipate, or is FPL already playing when it comes to ensuring that the transition to renewables is equitable? What specific things are you undertaking?
Well, I think a lot about, where they're going. So just to give everybody some stats on, a typical solar set that we build, we have 42 operating today. And as I mentioned before, we have a lot more that are underway. But each one of these is about 400 acres of panels, right? Some space between the rows of panels, but a substantial footprint, right? And sometimes there's transmission, right? It's not that all the land is necessarily under the existing transmission. So sometimes we have short runs to get to our transmission system. So both of those are impact, right? We're not building in downtown Miami or Broward or Palm Beach County. I mean, typically we're the parts of the state where it's more rural, obviously, and open, and land was cheaper for us to go to. So a lot of our team, my team here, that does development, thinks about engagement with the local community, right? And what is the, obviously we're coming, a lot of times there's not a lot of neighbors out there, so it's easier. It may be a farmer who was farming something many years ago and really is just looking to sell the land and get out of the business. There is, unfortunately, a lot of greening and citrus, right? So we find that around the state. But other times we run into areas where there's communities, right? Groups that are living out there, and maybe they moved out to the center of Florida to be away from all of us who live on the coastlines, right? So I think our team is very sensitive, right? I think we have that in our DNA because we serve, again, 5.6 million meters. That's like 11 or 12 million people. I mean, big FPL is used to dealing with all of Florida. And I think we have some of that, sensitivity and awareness and going in and taking feedback early on. I will say there's been some other developers that have come into the state and they haven't done that. They haven't engaged the community, understood the local issues, how to maybe modify their project, and they've run into trouble and not gotten their project permitted ultimately. So if we're going to keep doing this in the state, if we're going to keep taking the state to, on this journey to zero carbon, we have got to find a way to work with those in those, rural communities, right, where the land is today, and be very thoughtful about how we design the system. One thing to think about too, and you think about how Florida was developed, right? over time, and 80 or whatever percent lives within 10 miles of the coast, many of our generating units, right, and this goes back to when we burned oil, are on the coastline, right, for cooling and for access to the, to port to bring fuel in. That's obviously not true anymore with gas. It's a different way to ship it in via pipelines. Maybe in the future those are green hydrogen, but the point is the generators are where the load is, right? And the system in Florida was designed to deliver energy primarily to those points. As we go into the state and we build out solar, we are having to think about almost inverting the system and turning that around. So that means a lot of projects, potentially a lot of impact. And again, I think if you get this right early on, you save yourself a lot of headaches in the future. And we know we have a long, long way to go. So it's very important that we keep equity in mind, that we keep stakeholder interest in mind, and that we do a lot of engagement with the community and forming partnerships with others. Because as big as FPL is, we cannot get this done alone. We need the help of many others in the state to do our part, right, to shift the system mix.
Yeah. And I think, obviously a huge amount of what needs to happen for this energy transition comes down to new infrastructure and new transmission lines and new batteries that you mentioned before. And all of those things, yes, it's something that the utility has to take the lead on, but it's not something that you can do by yourself. And I want to pick up on that point, and also to Ryan's point earlier, that to meet these ambitious net zero or zero carbon commitments, we need a combination of steps, whether that's increasing energy efficiency or electric vehicle use, transitioning the kinds of energy sources to things like solar and wind, and then also making sure that all sectors are engaged. Partnerships are paramount. We have to have those. And so I'm wondering for all of you, I'll start with Toya, what do you think needs to happen to enhance collaboration between all of the people or all of the entities that are involved in this transition? Local governments, utilities, the private sector, private homeowners. Are there specific partnerships that you'd like to see, or ways that you think we could improve collaboration in Florida or in general?
Yeah, I'm going to give a really interesting example of what I've seen with our actual program at IREC, where we have a Puerto Rico Solar Financing Innovation Working Group. So one of the things is establishing these working groups, but this specific one it makes the makeup is a diverse set of stakeholders. So from private banking, public officials, solar companies, insurance firms. And really, what they've done is establish some priorities to reduce the risk or perception of risk, so that the banking sector is eager to offer solar financing to a broader sector of the economy. So, and they've collaboratively worked together to create a specific solar loan. So really transitioning that and moving it, broadening it out to a larger stakeholder group would be really interesting to see. At least that's one of the hopes that I would like to see out of this. So how this sort of model can be, refined and duplicated amongst those other sectors, whether it's EV. And one of the things that we've actually established as a Sustainable Energy Committee working group, where we have code officials that actually attend that, and then the Teslas of EV, the charge points, the EV goes that attend this, and they discuss some of the challenges they're finding with the adoption of these clean energy solutions. And we actually work through code changes and proposals, and that is actually taken up all the way up the food chain. And specific change is being made that is to the code to make it more favorable. So I think establishing more working groups like these, where the individuals have a common goal, would be something I would like to see.
Great. And obviously SolSmart and IREC have played a tremendous role in bringing together those kinds of partnerships. And Ryan, I'm going to you as well on this question of sort of how can collaboration improve, what things are working and what things could get better when it comes to all the different partners. And specifically in Chamber's experience, I'm wondering if there are things that have worked really well, or things that you see as opportunities going forward.
Sure. And I'll say, beyond chambers are certainly an important part of the conversation, but we work with all aspects of the group. Those are typically the groups that we work with the most. But one beautiful thing about chambers of commerce across the nation is that they are known as conveners, and they are conveners to solve tough problems and community problems and promote community prosperity, economic opportunity. And this is one of the great opportunities out there as well for the energy sector. I think with partnerships, you have to find a way or to promote partnerships and greater partnerships to really make all this happen. You've got to find ways to bring everyone to the table and recognize their importance in this, pretty vast energy landscape. Utilities are certainly selling the energy to the majority of customers in a community. Whether or not they're developing a particular project, they're certainly responsible for operating and maintaining most of the infrastructure along the way for a particular project. Developers are able to take advantage of tax credits that maybe utilities aren't able to, and they can take private sector dollars and invest them in solar developments, for example. And really, the private sector is also responsible for that huge decline in pricing over time. I mean, we've seen an enormous drop in pricing of up to 90% over the last 10 years in solar costs because of that, the innovation and demand that the private sector is really giving it. And then policymakers need to be at the table to truly understand the pros and cons of expanding energy opportunity and making sure that they put in place not only good energy policy, but equitable energy policy. And of course, the business community should be at the table too, in my opinion, because generally the business community will be driving a lot of that investment, and they have the resources to help move everyone forward and really look out for the economics of a region.
Great. Matt, I'm going to go to you with a similar version of this question, thinking about collaboration and what we can do better. What, from FPL's perspective, in particular, we're sitting, with an audience of many people from local government today. What sorts of things work as far as collaboration with local governments in the state of Florida, and what do you feel are sort of areas for improvement, things that would make more of these partnerships come to fruition?
Well, we're certainly doing more than we ever have in that area. I think one thing which is true, whether it's commercial and industrial customers, municipal customers, is a desire for choice, right? And looking for different types of solutions. And that could come from us, could come from, as Ryan and Toy have said, the private sector. And certainly Florida's got a vibrant market of different third-party installers for rooftop systems, battery systems, and then you've got what's going on in transportation too. So I think what's going well is and I go back to that community solar program, us hearing a desire, right? Again, you could do other things. You could buy RECs, you could do rooftop solar, you could look for other different means to try to meet the sustainability goals, right? Which really started popping up, in force, I think, in the state in 2016, 17, 18. Was that community solar program, which was our answer to, we hear you, let us try to create an offering, take advantage of the scale that we have, and try to give good economics and good terms, in a program. But since that community solar program, what we'll be launching next year is a program to help with fleet electrification, right? And so that's very germane to, the municipalities in the state. We see fleet electric vehicles. Now, if you could get one right now, right, I think in a year they'll start coming, but the total cost of ownership, we're seeing break-evens happen now, particularly on light-duty and medium-duty vehicles. And with the federal funding that's in the infrastructure bill, and if the other Build Back Better bill goes in Washington, there's more incentives for those. We see that as being economic today. So if you're a municipality, you have a fleet of vehicles, you want to convert over, one thing that we're offering, starting next year is, as a trusted advisor, we'll help run the analytics and show, and we're not in the vehicle business, but we'll show that makes sense or doesn't. And then with this tariff, we can help build out charging depot infrastructure if you don't desire to pay the capital or if you don't desire to operate it, right? I think there's other choices out there like that over time that we're considering and we may launch, because what's different than 5 or 10 years ago is sustainability goals, right? Everybody is looking at their own carbon footprint and saying, how do I eliminate this? If you go back to any utility 10 years ago, it was, we sell you power, we try to do it affordable, reliable, clean, but we're not thinking much about choices. And I think that's the shift. And so to the partnership point, that is getting our team talking a lot more, not only to municipalities, but major national retailers that usually have, good lessons learned around the country. And then we're spending more time with residential customers too, understanding, well, what solutions could we provide there, right? So I think you're going to see more of that from us. But as the industry, right, heavy industrial and the transportation sector electrify, that is more opportunities for partnerships. And so we're starting to think about what is our role, how do we help enable that transition there too, not just in our traditional sector.
Well, it's great to hear that so much of what FPL is thinking about is in terms of partnerships, and also that, as the demand for renewable energy increases, that's something that it sounds like you're listening to, and not just for the economic reasons, but because people are asking for it. So I'm really glad to hear that. I want to shift now to our audience Q&A. We've had questions coming in online, and then I'd encourage our audience members to keep submitting those through the live Q&A function. I'm going to start by actually going back to you, Matt. We have a question asking about energy efficiency with buildings, and sort of, that's one of the main ways in which we can work on decarbonization, by making buildings more energy efficient, in addition to the sort of changing the makeup of our energy portfolio. So this is a question from Michelle. She's wondering, does FPL have any plans to invest in an energy efficiency program for commercial buildings to incentivize energy efficient design and electrification?
So we have some programs today. I think they could certainly be expanded, but under our demand side management energy efficiency, so every utility in the state of Florida has to have a set of programs and goals, right? And that's, if you're following the news and this part of the industry, that's been up, much for debate as to what does that look like going forward. But we have certain programs today. A lot of them are focused on residential to help with energy home audits. We have an energy analyzer tool to help you understand where your energy use is energy demand is coming from, and then B, what do you do about that? A little bit less so on the commercial side, but I think again, that's an area that is probably ripe for exploration. I will say one point on energy efficiency that has been really successful that we launched a number of years ago was just LED lighting, right? And we have a program and a team that converts traditional, street lights or other parking lot lights to LEDs, and that has really taken off in the last couple of years. But I think it's, there's a lot of stuff going on. I think it's an area of opportunity that we could look at, particularly for C&I municipalities.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I'm going to ask you briefly to weigh on this as well, as far as what chambers, what either policies that you've seen or things that you're hearing chambers call for when it comes to, or to look for when it comes to energy efficiency in buildings. Are there specific things that you think would be progressive and good ideas for people to be learning about today?
Sure. I think Matt honestly hit on most of the points there. I will add in saying that energy efficiency is realistically the number one clean energy job in America from every report I've ever seen. So not only is there just a good opportunity to decrease emissions from being more energy efficient and use less power for that matter, but also it's a job creator in and of itself. I think one of the things that I have seen is more of a transition to communities at least looking to rate buildings. In some cases, it's just not probably cost effective to retrofit an entire building. And it may be more cost effective to look at how do we build new buildings that are more energy efficient, because recognizing those buildings are going to be in place for decades to come. So certainly you want to be able to do what you can with existing buildings, but you also want to say, hey, if we're putting a piece of land and we're going to develop a building on it, whether it's small or large, that's going to be there for a long time. Let's make sure that's the cleanest envelope possible for that area. And at the same time, looking at how do we benchmark our various buildings in our community, which building, for example, if it's going up for sale, how does that rate on an energy efficiency level? And really being transparent into what that building currently is, has in store in terms of whether it's built out or has opportunity to be more energy efficient itself. What do the emissions look like from a particular building, and how efficient is it?
Great, thank you. So obviously benchmarking is important and a critical step there. I'm going to go back to another question for you, Matt, and I may ask Toya you to weigh in on this in just a minute too. But Matt, several people in the chat have asked about the environmental hazards associated with different aspects of FPL's operations. There's concern about Turkey Point, but then also, the fact that a lot of FPL's portfolio is still natural gas and other fossil fuel dependent energy sources. So I guess I'm curious to hear from you, what do you feel are the greatest obstacles to moving away rapidly from fossil fuel sources? And, we talked before about potentially new commitments being released in 2025, 2030. But what are the things that, as we are right now, stand in the way of, let's say, going to net zero or zero carbon tomorrow?
I think really, there's some short-term stuff, right? So costs are up. Solar prices are actually up for the first time that anybody can remember. There's shipping, commodities, all kinds of other things. So there's still some tariffs out there. So there's a little bit of a blip on the system. But the only thing I think that's really in the way is just the scale, right? I don't know if most people have, the sense of just how many solar panels you need to replace one of those big power plants, right? And then remember that solar just generates, in a profile that peaks at noon, but it's coming off in the evenings and coming up in the mornings versus round-the-clock power, right? So it's economic, but it's just the sheer number that would need to be built and the transmission that would need to connect it and the battery storage that would need to store that energy to turn over a system as large as ours, or really like anywhere in the country. I mean, it truly is a moonshot, right? To get all this done at the scale that we're talking about for a major state like Florida. And again, we're the largest renewable energy company, in the country. We're totally for renewables. I think we're running into some issues with, as you put, this is a little more technical point, but as you put more batteries and solar on the system, you actually need to put additional elements to help balance that out, right? Additional elements that we hadn't been thinking about, and run a grid on power sources that are not dispatchable, right? We can't turn the solar on and off. One of the elements that we see is key to kind of tying this together in our state where wind doesn't work, right? Because of loose soil and the wind resource isn't as good. And by the way, of hurricanes and migratory birds. So we look at it every 5 years, but I think it's green hydrogen, right? And that's the other piece of the mix. So I don't think anything is in the way. It's economic to do outside of federal policy, probably, or state policy pushing us even faster. What you're seeing right now is just pure economics driving, our transition. And again, just to let everybody know how much we've done in the last couple of years, I said the one time around planet Earth are 42 400-acre sites, and that's moved the needle to about 5% solar today, and zero carbon on the system, and then the nuclear units that we have represent about 20%, right? Now there's no coal left, there's no oil, so the remaining fleet is fairly clean, but I think that's what we're thinking about on the next set of goals, right? How fast can we get to, and what's the next point that we notch in the absence of any other federal policy pushing us there.
Great, thank you. Toya, in the last 30 seconds or so here, I just want to ask you to weigh in on that question as well. What to you is the biggest obstacle to making an energy transition tomorrow?
So what I find specifically in our work with local governments is the translation of the information that we're providing. So I don't think it's always received in the way that we would like it to. A lot of times we're working with local governments to look at their ordinances and streamline those ordinances and make sure they're favorable to solar deployment. And there is pushback. So what I would like to see is change in that, and local governments being able to, really think about some of these sustainability goals and being able to achieve them, and making sure that they're adopting ordinances that are favorable to solar deployment.
Great, and obviously SolSmart and IREC are terrific resources so thank you for your work here. And thanks to all of you, Ryan, Matt, for joining us today. This has been a terrific conversation. And I particularly appreciate that all of you are very committed to and verbally enthusiastic about partnerships and the importance of that. So I'm glad that we could make space for that today. Lauren, I'm going to hand it back over to you now to wrap us up here.
Thank you so much, Kate, for moderating this session, and to our speakers for participating in this great discussion. The stakes really couldn't be higher for Southeast Florida, but there really is huge opportunity if we can advance an ambitious decarbonization agenda. Next, I invite you to join us in remembering some of our climate champions that Southeast Florida has lost in the last year. To join the next session, please go back to the CVent portal and click on the link for the next session. Thank you so much again for joining.